Not too long ago, my wife Alana and I, we went south on vacation. And while we were enjoying a warm, sunny day by the pool, we overheard this argument breaking out on the other side of the deck. It was between a 5 or 6-year-old boy and his mother. The boy was standing on the pool step halfway into the water, and Mom was laying on a lounge chair, sunglasses on and earbuds in. Clearly, the boy was annoying his mom, begging her to come and play with him in the pool. And out of frustration and anger, Mom took one of her earbuds out and screamed at her son, "I played with you yesterday. Today is Mommy's day." She put her earbud back in, sunglasses back down, applied some more tanning lotion, and laid back down on her chair. Not, "I played with you earlier, just give me a minute." Not, "I'll play with you in a little bit, just entertain yourself for now." But, "I played with you yesterday. Today is Mommy's day." I love that story. Listen, if you're a parent, you've been here, right? And even if you don't have kids, you know the feeling of finally snapping after a bunch of overstimulation or irritation. And look, my point here is not to comment on her parenting. I mean, we've all been there. But the point that I want to make is this. We're all looking for better leaders, right? Simon Sinek, in his book, Leaders Eat Last, he says that a good leader sacrifices what belongs to him or her in order to give the team what they need. And bad leaders do just the opposite. Bad leaders sacrifice their teams in order to benefit themselves. Bad leaders say things like, "Today is Mommy's day." And you know what that's like. Perhaps at some point you've worked for a terrible boss who's always throwing the team under the bus. Maybe you've worked for someone who takes all the credit when things go well, but dishes all the criticism when they don't. Perhaps you've had a teacher who cared more about being liked by the kids than actually teaching the kids. Or perhaps you've had a parent who sacrificed you in order to do their own thing. Good leaders do the opposite. Good leaders provide for their people. They protect their people, and they do it at a cost to themselves. And I think we all want to follow leaders like that. We've always wanted to follow leaders like that. Now, you may be wondering, well, what does any of this have to do with Christmas? Well, this conversation is part of a series where we're exploring whether or not Christmas still matters, and if it does, what its meaning might be. To do that, we've been visiting this Old Testament text that often gets quoted on Christmas cards this time of year. "For to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace." Now, these words were spoken and then written by a man named Isaiah living during the 8th century before the Common Era. He was predicting that someday a king would come and bring about a better kingdom for everyone to live in, better than the one they were already in. And we've already talked about the first two terms, the Wonderful Counselor and Mighty God. So now when Isaiah used the term Everlasting Father, you need to know he wasn't exactly talking about poolside parenting. And yet, there is a connection. You see, it was customary in the ancient Near East for the leaders of nations to give themselves the title of father. The reason is because kings saw themselves as the genesis and the protector and the provider of their own people. Their general line of thinking was, "I made you into a people, I gave you a home, I protected you from harm, I am your king and your father." So, when Isaiah's prediction of a future leader included this title, Everlasting Father, it became this direct challenge to his current king, a guy named Ahaz. You see, Ahaz is the perfect example of a bad leader. After surrendering his kingdom to the Assyrian Empire, Ahaz fell in love with the Assyrian way of life, their buildings, their culture, their ruling style, and their religious worship. He loved it so much that he started setting up altars on every street corner in the towns of Judah and then demanding that people make sacrifices on all of those altars day and night. More altars means more sacrifices. More sacrifices means more animals, crops, and resources to be sacrificed. And more resources to be sacrificed meant less resources to feed his own people. But hey, Ahaz looked good before his Assyrian overlords. but really he was sacrificing the needs of his own people. He impoverished his nation. But the Assyrian emperor wasn't much better. I mean, one of the ways that the Assyrian Empire kept control over its growing territory was to violently remove their conquered inhabitants and make them live in other places in the empire and house them somewhere else. Why would they do that? Well, because it's really hard to maintain your own culture and your religious practices when you're uprooted from your own land and people. It's hard to maintain your national pride when you aren't anywhere near your nation and separated from a lot of your own people. It kind of shakes your identity to the core. You see, the Assyrian emperor wasn't seeking the flourishing of his people. He wanted to break their spirit and diminish their identity so that ultimately they could be put to work to serve the empire, so that every day could be Daddy's day. Now, while Isaiah's words were an affront to Ahaz in particular, they kind of took on a life of their own and became words of hope for the people of Judah, not just in that generation, but for generations to come. Especially as they experienced bad leaders again and again and again. I mean, remember, after the Assyrians came the Babylonians, after the Babylonians came the Persians, and sure, the Persians were a little nicer to the people of Judah, but not that much nicer. And after the Persians came the Greeks, and then finally the Greeks were conquered by the Romans. Empires over and over built on being a tyrant and self-focused leader. The Caesar of Rome eventually moved from the title of being a father to a straight-up god. He took himself from dad to deity. But every single one of those empires eventually fell. None of them were everlasting, which always left the people hoping for and longing for a king who would come someday and rule like a leader who would provide for and protect the people. A leader who would be willing to sacrifice themselves in order to give people what they needed most. Now, the earliest disciples of Jesus believed that they knew that king. They believed that Jesus was that leader. And here's why. Once while they were walking along the road, James and John, two of Jesus' disciples, they approached him away from the crowds, away from the other disciples, so that no one could hear. And they asked him, hey, when you start this whole kingdom of God thing, can we sit at your left and at your right? Can we be in charge with you? Can we be the guys who make the rules? Because boy, are we sick and tired of having to bend the knee to the current world order. We're sick and tired of paying taxes to the current overlords. We're tired of living in poverty while our rulers live in luxury at our expense. We want to live in luxury at their expense. We want them to pay us. We want them to bend the knee to us. And come on, Jesus, we've been with you since the beginning. Other than Peter and Andrew, we're basically your OG disciples. Let us rule right next to you. And Jesus says to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. In other words, I get that the current system of leadership is to sacrifice the needs of the people in order to benefit the leader. But in my kingdom, we're not just going to flip the script. We're not just going to turn the tables. We aren't trying to put our own people in charge so that we can sacrifice the needs of others and serve ourselves. No, in my kingdom, says Jesus, the leaders will be the chief servants. In my kingdom, those who rule will be the first to serve on their knees. Those who lead will leverage their position for the good of their people, not leverage their people for the good of their own position. For even the Son of Man, which is a reference to himself, came not to be served but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many, because that's what good leaders do. Another time, Jesus was with his disciples sitting around a dinner table, and he recognized that there was no servant designated to wash the feet of the guests, which is what normally would have happened. And so he got on his hands and knees. He wrapped a towel around his waist, and he began to wash his disciples' feet. And after it all, he said to them, do you understand what I've done for you? I mean, you call me master and teacher, which is fine because that's what I am. But if this master and teacher is willing to get on his hands and knees to wash your feet, how much more should you be willing to do it for one another? Over And over again, Jesus modeled this type of servant leadership, the type of leader who would give of himself for the sake of everyone else, who would put the needs of the team ahead of his own. And over time, the disciples became quite certain that Jesus was perhaps that long-predicted king that Isaiah was telling us about, the one who would finally restore peace and justice and righteousness to their world. That is, of course, until once again the rulers of the world did what they always do and sacrificed the people in order to meet their own needs. See, the Assyrians of Ahaz's day, they moved those they conquered to other geographical places in order to break their spirit. But if those people refused to be broken, they were beheaded. Their heads were then displayed on spears for everybody else to see. And the Romans of Jesus' day learned from that. They skipped the cranial displacement and went straight to crucifixion, though. An equally public, but much more painful way to die. So when the disciples saw Jesus hanging from the cross, breathing his last, they were pretty sure that they were wrong about the whole everlasting father figure king. I mean, it's kind of hard to be everlasting when you're dead. That is, until 3 days later, when the disciples saw Jesus, and over 500 others saw Jesus risen from the dead. I mean, the only reason that the disciples believed that Jesus was the foretold father-like king was because they saw him do the most everlasting thing possible: rise from the dead. Isaiah said that someday a king would come who would be like a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, and an everlasting Father, the kind of leader who would give his own life for the sake of his own people, rather than violently coerce his people to give their lives for him. That's the kind of leader that Jesus is. And that's why I'm a follower of Jesus, because I'm also looking for that kind of leader in my life. I mean, it can be so frustrating to watch so many of the tyrants of our world, the politicians or the pastors or the actors or the directors or those who have tremendous falls from grace, all because they routinely put their own needs, their own wants, their own desires ahead of those that they lead and inspire. But if I'm honest, the reason that I long for it is because I don't see it in myself. I mean, at the heart of so many of my problems and difficulties is that I'm unwilling to give up my own wants for the sake of someone else. And we have a word for that. We call it sin. And I know that word has a lot of baggage to it, and maybe it does for you, and I get that. I'm not using that word to describe anybody else. It's a word I use to describe what's going on inside. And the truth is, sin is at the heart of so much of the pain and suffering in this world that's caused by people, I think, but certainly what's caused by me. And ultimately, that separates me from God. But here's the point of Christmas. God so loved this world that he was willing to put on flesh and to dwell among us, to be the leader that we all needed, the kind of leader who would show us the forgiveness of God and who'd be willing to give his own life for it. I mean, the entire mission behind Christmas is to simply point to Jesus and say, that's what God is like. He's the kind of king who gives his own life in order to benefit his people, to benefit me. You. And the real invitation of Christmas is to start following him in your life, to try to live like him. I mean, could you imagine if people actually lived this out themselves? Picture a political landscape in which politicians gave themselves for the sake of others and their enemies. Picture a parenting style or a pastoring style or picture a management style. You get it. I mean, how much different would our world be if just Jesus followers started modeling the Savior in their small corner of the world? How much different would my world be if I started modeling Jesus and his leadership in my small corner of the world?